Hello, and thank you for joining us. The following video is one of a series of webinars hosted by the Institute of Economic Affairs in cooperation with the Princeton Center, University of Buckingham. In this video, we hear from Professor Chandran Kukathas from Singapore Management University, who discusses immigration and freedom.
Thank you very much, Syed, and it's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you for having me here to speak. So the subject of my talk today is immigration, which, as everyone recognizes, is very much a hot topic and has been for a while, and we anticipate that it's going to be so for some time to come, whether we're talking about the UK or the United States or Australia, or for that matter in Singapore, where it's also a very important issue. Now, there are many critics of immigration, many people who are anxious about immigration, and the typical anxiety of people who are in favor of less immigration, if not of reducing it dramatically, is that in some way immigration poses a threat to the society in question that's hosting or welcoming immigrants. People are worried about the impact of immigration on the economy. They're also worried about the impact of immigration on the society in broader terms. They're worried about cultural transformation. They worry in liberal democratic societies that this might lead to an erosion of some fundamental values, the values, I think most importantly, of freedom and equality. So in my presentation, what I want to do is take a look at one particular aspect of immigration that's not really been, I think, sufficiently recognized or acknowledged, and that is the impact not so much of immigration on society as the impact of immigration control on society. And my broad thesis is that if we're worried about the fundamental values of a liberal democracy, and in my remarks I'm going to focus mostly on liberal democracies and on Britain in particular, if we're worried about the impact of immigration on liberal democracies, then what we should be worrying about more than we have is the impact or the implication of immigration control. Immigration control, in fact, may pose a more serious threat to our fundamental values than immigration itself. Now, the question is, why would one think this? So in order to understand this point, I think it's important to recognize, firstly, what immigration is. Now, immigration is not the same as migration. Birds migrate, but they don't immigrate. In order to immigrate, you have to actually cross a political boundary, enter a new society, a new country. In the modern world, you have to enter a state. That's what immigration is about. It's about changing jurisdictions internationally. And this is how immigration today is generally conceived and understood. But now just crossing the border does not make you an immigrant. If you think about it, how many people cross the border into and out of Britain every year? The figure is about 70 million. Okay? This is just the traffic across borders in all directions. Of course, in the last few months, it's been somewhat reduced by the impact of coronavirus, and I'll say something about this shortly. But the crucial thing is that there's a huge number of people crossing borders all the time. In the United States, it's about 380 million border crossings every year. And that's not even including the number of ships, trains, buses, lorries, container ships bringing in goods. The volume is so great that in the US, for example, only about 5% of the goods transported into the country are even given the most cursory of inspections. There's just too much volume. Okay? So the first thing to recognize out of this is that immigration control is not primarily about border control, because people who cross the border are not necessarily immigrants. In fact, only a tiny, tiny proportion of these people are immigrating. Most of them are actually coming to visit for some other reason, maybe as tourists, maybe they're coming to play football, maybe they're delivering goods, maybe they're simply transporting other people. But only a tiny percentage of these people are actually moving in order to enter a country in order to stay. Now, this raises another interesting question, which is actually, what is the length of stay relevant to make someone an immigrant? Is it a week? Is it a month? Is it a year? Well, when you think about it, there's no obvious answer to this question because this is not a natural condition. It's not as if somehow you can distinguish immigrants from non-immigrants merely by their appearance, but we can't even do it by the length of stay because even that is something that's legally and politically determined. It's not something that we can establish, say, sociologically or by looking at social patterns in some way. An immigrant is how, an immigrant is someone who is an immigrant because we've so decided to define a person as such. So immigration control is really about not controlling people's movement from one side of the boundary into the other. That doesn't make you an immigrant. What makes you an immigrant is that you've been categorized as such. What immigration control is about is really deciding who is and is not allowed into a country for a determined amount of time. And also, it's about determining what those people can do. Even if you come in for, say, a 6-month visa, that may not make you an immigrant because you may not have the kinds of rights that you need in order to be classified really as an immigrant. What immigration control is about mostly is determining whether or not people can work, whether they can reside, whether they can stay more than for a certain amount of time, whether they can go to school, whether they go to college. Only when you do these things do you come to be classified as an immigrant. Otherwise, you're just a visitor, a transitory, a sojourner, something else other than an immigrant. So what an immigrant is in terms of identity is a matter of legal and political determination. Now, this leads us to another interesting problem then. If the definition of an immigrant is something that's determined politically and legally, well, what do we say then about the people who are already there? How do we know that they're not immigrants? What makes them natives or nationals? Well, given that the definition of an immigrant is already simply a matter of the choices that are made legally and politically, so is it in fact the case that who is a native or a national is something that's determined not just by looking at who is naturally a native, it's a matter of political determination. So immigration control is the thing I think we should be looking at a little bit more closely and asking what it is. And the point that I want to make is that what immigration control is about is controlling not whether people cross the border, but it's about controlling what they may do once they've crossed the border, whether they can work primarily, whether they can reside, whether they can open a bank account, whether they can rent a property, and so on. Now, the reason that this is interesting and perhaps a problem is that in order to control people wanting to do these things, what you've got to do is you've got to control your own citizens, your own residents, because otherwise they're likely to employ, to admit to college, to trade with, to help set up business, or help simply reside, all these people who are regarded as immigrants. In order to control immigration, you've got to start controlling your own citizens. You've got to start regulating your employers. You've got to start regulating your universities. You've got to start regulating your landlords, your banks. Now, of course, we do these things all the time, but the more seriously you control immigration, the more seriously you have to control all of these things. And I'm going to elaborate on this in a moment. But here's the other thing that's really important for us to consider if we're concerned about the way in which immigration control has a bearing on the freedom of not just outsiders, but of insiders. Because you see, the first step to immigration control is not actually border control. It's not controlling whether people set up business or go to university or take a job. It actually comes even earlier. The first step to immigration control is classification. Because I said, how do you know who is an immigrant and who is a native or who is a national? So let me illustrate this with an example from history. Right now, officially speaking, there are roughly 60 million people who live in the UK, of which some portion, it may be 45 million, it may be a little bit more, maybe less, who are actually citizens of the country. There are 60 million, but a little bit fewer, who are actually entitled to full rights of residency. But now, if you go back to, say, the 1920s, the people who were classified as Britons was actually quite a lot larger. In fact, the population of British nationals in the world was about 400 million. And this is because of the British Empire. Everyone in the empire was classified as a Briton. If you want the authoritative work on this, look at Franzman's British nationality law. It's a work of about 2,000 pages classifying every aspect of British nationality law that's been transformed mostly over the last 100 years. And what it makes clear is that for long periods of British history, the people of Grenada, going up to 1980, the people of Jamaica, the people of India, people of Malaya, people of Australia, Canada, they were all Britons. Enoch Powell himself said in the 1960s and 70s, the population of Britain at the end of the Second World War was closer to 800 million. And as he put it, all these people had the absolute right to travel across the empire and reside in Britain because they were, by British law, British nationals. They were British. They paid British taxes. They were subject to British law. Now, what happened over the post-war period was that their status was gradually eroded and changed until finally in the 1980s, all of these people lost their nationality. Some had a choice in the matter, many of them did not. Now, my point in all of this is that since the purpose behind the stripping of nationality from all of these people was primarily to prevent them from moving from Britain to Britain freely, the whole point of immigration control is, in fact, to limit not just what outsiders can do, it's actually to limit the number of people who can be regarded as insiders, who can be regarded as nationals. So the first step in immigration control is the control of nationality, is the control of identity. The first step in immigration control is classification. Now, if that's the case, one of the things we've got to ask is, what is the basis of classification? And here, one of the problems we've got is that classification tends to be determined not by concerns about economics, concerns about culture, concerns about somehow finding the right national identity. It comes down to politics. It comes down to whose interests are going to dominate. And this is something that I think ought to be regarded as worrying if we're concerned about some fundamental values, which are the values of freedom and equality. Who gets to decide who is a national and who is an immigrant? So this is the first thing I think we need to think about. The other thing I think we should reflect on is the extent to which trying to continue to control immigration means trying to continue to control what people do once they're in the country as immigrants. And here the crucial thing is the extent to which what countries do to control these outsiders is control citizens and residents of a society, imposing more and more limitations on the freedoms of citizens to engage with outsiders. Now, this is an enormous topic. The most obvious respect in which this control is exercised is over employers who are faced with all kinds of restrictions But I want to draw attention to the fact that it's not just employers or institutions that are affected by this. It's actually very ordinary citizens. To give you one simple example, every year, about 20,000 Britons are prevented from reuniting with their spouses because they've had the misfortune, if you like to call it that, of falling in love with and marrying someone from abroad. And because of this, they are unable to bring their partner to Britain because they don't meet the minimum qualification financially. In order to be able to sponsor anyone, including your spouse, you have to have an income of at least £18,000 a year. Otherwise, you're simply not eligible to do this. And there are literally 20,000 cases every year of Britons who are denied the right to reunite with their own partners. So this is just one illustration of the extent to which immigration control is actually not just controlling outsiders, it's actually controlling people within a country. It's controlling and limiting the freedom of citizens. I could give you numerous examples of this sort of thing, but here's another even more dramatic case, in this case not of policy in the United Kingdom, but in the United States. Between 1930 and 2005, 1 million Americans were deported. 1 million American citizens, not residents of America, but 1 million American citizens were deported, obviously by mistake, but in the process of immigration control. And this continues to happen across the world, including in Britain. If you look at the detention camps around Europe, and this includes Britain, something like 1% of the people in the detention camps at any one time are UK and EU citizens. The effort of immigration control means continually interfering with the freedom of citizens in order to achieve some objective. And I think here's the thing, the more seriously you try to achieve the objective of control, say the objective of bringing down the numbers of immigrants, the more seriously you run the risk of badly affecting your own citizens. The more likely it is that you are to deport your own citizens, the more likely you are to detain your own citizens, the more likely you are to limit their freedoms in one way or another. So I think this is something that really is worth looking at more closely. I'm not suggesting that it supplies you with a decisive reason for, say, eliminating immigration control. I'm not suggesting that. But I think we need to look at this side of the ledger, because we've spent, I think, a lot of time looking at the economic impact of immigration control, looking at the cultural impact, but not enough time looking at the impact of immigration control on the freedom of the citizens of a society. So there are many more things I could say about this, but I can see that my time is starting to run out, and I want to leave as much time as possible for questions. So perhaps I'll just stop at that point and maybe address some of the other issues I wanted to talk about through the Q&A.
Well, thank you very much, Chandran. That was a very, very good start for us, provocative in some ways, but which is exactly what we want. Just to let people know, in the chat function, I have posted one link to Fransman's British nationality law. I'm not expecting you to run out and buy it, but at least it's there because Chandran referred to it. I'm also about to post a link on the most recent IEA publication on immigration. Just to be clear, there is no IEA one policy on immigration. As classical liberals from across the spectrum of classical liberalism, we have a range of views, but the latest book was by Christian Niemitz on immigration, called Immigration Picking the Low-Hanging Fruits, on immigration policy post-Brexit for the UK. And clearly there are lots of internal debates within the IEA. So far we have about 4 questions. Before I come to those questions, maybe I'll throw a couple myself, and also that will give people time, hopefully, to submit other questions. We've got plenty of time, so please feel free to submit questions using the Q&A. Chandran, let me start with a couple of questions. No country really has a complete open borders. No one, and very few people would agree that you should have complete open borders. There will be some control, even if it's at the limit of no criminals, no terrorists. Clearly, you'll go a bit further. Maybe there are cultural issues that you might say, well, okay, if you have more than one spouse, your first spouse can join you, but your second spouse can't join you. Or you can only come in if you can fund yourself and not rely on the welfare system of the country, or maybe after you've made a contribution. Where would you draw the line, as it were, on immigration policy, given there is really not a world without any control? What sort of controls, in your view, or restrictions, rather than controls, are reasonable from your perspective?
Okay. So I've deliberately avoided trying to put a case for something like open borders. As you say, there are very, very few people who simply argue for open borders. And there are also very, very few people who argue for completely closed borders. Most people are sort of in between. Okay? So I'm trying to address those who are sort of roughly in the middle, but there's a wide spectrum even in the middle. Okay, so I'm much more towards the open borders end of the spectrum. But the thing I think I'd like to make as the most important point here is that the idea of the border is something that we've also not thought about hard enough or discussed enough. We assume, for example, that when we talk about open borders, that we know what this means. But what exactly is an open border? Okay, so let me give you an example. Think about a country where it's very easy to move to as a tourist, but actually it's very hard to get the right to work and impossible to get the right to become a citizen. You can also imagine a country where it's very easy to get the right to work once you've been allowed to enter, but it's actually very hard to get permission to enter and almost impossible to get the right to become a citizen. Or you can imagine another country where it's really easy to enter, very hard to get the right to work, but if you do get the right to work, it's really easy to get citizenship, like Australia, because they encourage you to get citizenship. So which is the most open of these three examples that I've given you? Is it the one where it's really easy to become a citizen, or it's easy to get a job, or it's easy to become a tourist? Okay? So I think the first two categories are the most important ones, because very few people who move really think firstly of joining a club and becoming a member. They really mostly want to move because either they've got some personal connection or they're looking for gainful employment. Those are the two big motivations. And I think there I'd like to really make it much more open than it is. I don't think you can, set a fixed number. I don't think that makes sense, because what you've got to recognize is that conditions change. Societies are different. Their needs are different. I think what should be determining the answer to this question is what people in the society themselves want. Now, here the question is, what do I mean by this? Do I mean that everybody gets to vote on who I want to invite into my country? Or does each person have a certain amount of autonomy to invite people in to join them, whether to join their family or to join their workplace? And my thinking is you should leave that determination to the individuals, whether it's the person who wants to marry someone or the employer who wants to hire someone. If an employer wants to hire someone from outside, then that should be the prerogative of the employer. I can understand if you want to say, well, hang on, I don't want to be responsible for the welfare of this person. That's fair enough. Okay, if the employer wants to take on that liability, that's fine. If the person wants to come in and recognize that he has no entitlement to public assistance, which is what I did when I moved to London as professor at London School of Economics. My visa said not entitled to public funds. It's very normal. Well, I think that should be the way to think about it, rather than say, what's the number or what are the categories? Governments, for example, have lists of professions where there's a shortage, so we'll try to get more people like that. But they're always out of date, because by the time they've collected the data and published the information, it's already wrong. So I think what we need is a much more flexible set of guidelines dominated by the wishes of the people who want to associate with people outside.
And let's just push you a little bit on that. How do we determine that? You say you don't give people votes. I mean, we have very interesting debates about immigration, and I think most classical liberals will probably agree that a numbers cap is quite crude. Therefore, what are the criteria? Is it what the employers want, for example, and maybe that's the only criteria? Is it what employers want plus clearly humanitarian reasons for refugees rather than economic migrants? But how do you determine that? How do you work out what the people want? Is it, do you opinion poll them? Is it what's in the manifestos of the winning parties? How's that determined?
So if you're asking me about how this is to be determined politically, I think political parties are always going to be driven by what the polls say or what they think is going to be the consequences at elections. Now, there are lots of obvious things to be said about this, but here's something which I think we haven't acknowledged enough, that the fact that political parties are driven by the polling and popular opinion and so on tells you something important about the whole debate about immigration, which is that it's something that represents a conflict within the society about admitting people from outside. That is to say, it's not a conflict between insiders and outsiders, it's a conflict within the society about who should be allowed in. So my question is, why is it that one side or the other has to win? Why does this have to be decided collectively? If some people want to invite into this country or any other country people with whom they wish to associate, why is this something that's got to be a matter of concern for people who don't want to associate with them? If they don't want to employ these people, why is it that this is something that's really, gives them the power over their fellow citizens? Why should some citizens be able to stop other citizens from employing someone, associating with someone, marrying someone? This is it. So, of course, if you ask how are we to settle the question when there is this conflict, the only way to do it is through political parties bidding for one another's votes. But the outcome is arbitrary. The outcome is not somehow a reflection of what the people think. The outcome is simply a reflection of decisions made by leaders to say, okay, we can't satisfy the employers wholly, but we'll give them something. We can't satisfy those who don't want immigrants, so we'll give them something. There's nothing in the end that's going to be particularly rational about this. It's simply going to be a compromise depending upon where the weight of political power resides.
Okay, so we've got about half an hour. We've got about 10 questions, so let's see how many we can get through. You don't have to get through them all, depending on time. For those of you who have asked more than one question, what I will do is choose your first question in the league table, as it were, and then I'll go to other people before coming back to you for your second or third question if time allows. So, and please feel free, if you haven't submitted a question, to submit a question now. First question, maybe I've already asked on his behalf. It's from Dr. Edwin van der Haar, who writes a lot about classical liberalism and foreign policy. I suspect I've already covered this, so maybe if I have, we can move on. What would you like to propose instead? No control at all? Or how would that work out in your mind? I think we probably answered that question already. So Edwin, if you feel that I haven't asked that question, perhaps you could reformulate it and I'll come back to you. Is that okay? Next one is Radhika Trivedi. Do you think it is hypocritical for countries like America, largely built from the labor of immigrants, to now impose extremely restrictive immigration control?
Well, I guess firstly I'd say I don't think a country can be hypocritical. It's not a person, it's not a, and it's not somehow this abstract entity that makes policy. As I just mentioned a moment ago, the way in which policy is made is really a reflection of all kinds of political conflicts which result in a decision. So it's not as if I want to charge all Americans with being hypocritical. Okay. The second thing is that I'm not sure that there's really much to be gained by pursuing this particular line of argument to say that there's some kind of element of hypocrisy, because what it is that makes a country over the years includes all kinds of factors. It includes the contributions of immigrants. It includes the contributions of natives. But after all, it actually begins to get difficult to see what one means by saying, well, these are contributions made by immigrants, because, as I said before, it's not actually all that easy to say who is an immigrant and who is a native. Are the children of immigrants themselves classified as immigrants, or are they classified as natives? Is someone who's born in a country classified as a native, or if he's born to foreign parents, is classified as, as an immigrant? And here's the other thing to note. Different countries have very, very different norms about this, about what even counts as an immigrant. If you're born in the United States, you're automatically a citizen of the United States, without question. If you're born in Britain, you're not, unless you're born to British parents or one British parent. But this wasn't always the case. It used to be the case that if you were born in Britain, you were a British citizen. Same was true in Australia. It was not always true in the United States. At one point in the United States, even if a woman was born to, if a woman decided to marry a foreigner, she lost her citizenship in the United States. So the laws vary so much that even to say, look, immigrants are responsible for this and natives for that, I think is a very tricky thing to do. So I'm reluctant to go down this sort of path.
Okay, I see Radhika's got some more questions. I'll come back to those if we have time, Radhika, just allow others to ask a question. Rebecca Lowe is asking, the UK is recognising its obligations to Hong Kongers by setting up new routes to British citizenship as the people in Hong Kong suffer new constraints on their freedom. Now, the UK-Hong Kong relationship is in some sense special owing to the details of and commitments within the Sino-British Joint Declaration. But what general obligations do British citizens and the UK government have to people abroad who live in countries that were once part of the British Empire, and particularly to those in those countries who find themselves suffering state oppression?
Okay. That's a very, very complicated set of questions. It's not really a single question, but let me try to address it by going back to something that I said at the beginning when talking about the British Empire. Because in one sense, of course, the Hong Kongers are not unusual in the course of 20th century British history. When my parents were born in Malaya, as it was then, as a British colony, they were Malayan residents, but they were British nationals. They had no other nationality because Malaya was only a colony. It was not a country. It was not a nation. It did not have citizenship. Mind you, at that point, Britain had only just invented the category of British citizenship because the Citizenship Act didn't come into 1948. But over the years, what Britain did was it slowly contracted the entitlements to citizenship or British nationality with a succession of acts. 1961, most importantly, and then even more critically for many people, 1971, when Britain passed an immigration act that took away British nationality from people across the Commonwealth, though the intention was primarily to stop people who are from Africa with British nationality, because they feared that with the rise of Kenya and Uganda, a lot of Asians with British nationality were going to flee to Britain. So throughout this period, the kinds of things that Hong Kong has found itself facing is something that others in other parts of the empire have also faced. Now, as I said, this is a very complex question because you've asked not only about the claims of people who were once nationals, but also the claims of people who were subject to oppression in one way or another from particular regimes. I myself am reluctant to make too strong a distinction between the claims of people who are trying to escape oppression, because this means making some pretty critical judgments about other countries, but it also means making some judgments about the claims of those people who are fleeing oppression and the claims of those who may be, say, refugees fleeing natural disaster, fleeing war zones, not being deliberately oppressed, but nonetheless, having very, very serious concerns. Maybe they're just poor. Okay? Now, why is it that one category should be more favored than another? I think this is a very tricky thing to do, because you're trying to say to some people, your suffering counts less than someone else's suffering because of the cause, not because of the experience. So I think, I can't give you a full answer to this, but I've really only just given you a couple of things to think about with respect to this question.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Rebecca, perhaps you want to follow up. I'm sure Chandran will be happy to follow up. Joshua Ammons, I'm going to ask your most popular question, as it were. You say, thank you for joining us again as well, Joshua. This spring and probably this fall, or autumn for those of you in the UK, many universities across the world will feel the dire financial impacts of immigration controls put in place from COVID-19. What do you think will be the long-term impact of limited educational opportunities during this shock to the liberal university immigration policies that many countries enjoy?
Okay, so let me first say one thing about COVID-19 with respect to immigration policy, which is that I think it has very little bearing on immigration control. Because if I go back to my original point, immigration control is not primarily about controlling border crossing. It's about controlling what people do when they cross the border. So most of the controls that have been put in place because of COVID-19 are not restrictions on immigration, they're just restrictions on movement. They're restrictions on people gathering. And this is the case whether you're trying to move from Paris to London or London to Durham, as everyone in Britain already knows. So, immigration control is not an effective means of controlling pandemics or epidemics. Or, Of course, when something like this strikes, you may have to control movement, but not just international movement, not just movement across borders, but movements of all kinds. And that could be justified, in terms of public safety. Now, on the question of the impact of all of this on universities, I think here, once again, the issue is not really immigration, because here the problem that universities face everywhere is that they can't get people to come into the countries to join these institutions, as much because the institutions themselves cannot operate. If the institutions were able to operate because things were safe, then there'd be no reason not to let them into the country, and governments would immediately, make this possible. The problem is that, once you've got a virus having the impact that it's had, let's take the LSE, for example. Its entire summer school operation has been closed down, not because of immigration controls, but because you can't run the dormitories. You can't have people in classrooms. You can't have large lectures. That's the reason. It's not because of immigration control. So fixing immigration control is not going to do anything in this regard. What you've got to do is figure out how you're going to address the problem of the pandemic itself. I've lost the sound side.
Sorry, I hadn't unmuted myself. I apologize. Okay. So the next question, thank you, Joshua. Next question is from an anonymous attendee. But they ask, what is your opinion on the migration crisis in the EU? Turkey currently houses most of the refugees from Syria. Should the EU allow these refugees into the EU? And how will they cope with the influx of extra people and the public backlash? Now, before you answer that question, maybe I could make a comment. For many years, I know a number of people who were relatively open border classical liberals in the UK, until we actually had relatively open borders, were in the early years of the Blair government. Remember, Blair came to power saying that he wanted to rub the right's nose in multiculturalism and effectively had close to an open door policy. Many classical liberals rejoiced. but what you saw was a backlash and the growth of the BNP. Now, people at in nice, comfortable houses at middle-class dinner parties could feel morally superior about it, but if you were Black or Jewish or Asian in a working-class community, you were terrified about the rise of the BNP. And as a result, I saw a number of people who were previously in favor of open borders saying, actually, we have to be aware of the backlash. So one is I want to talk about the backlash, but I also want you to answer the main question, which was about the EU letting in refugees from Syria and how they should deal with the refugees from Syria.
Okay, so again, a very complex question. The straightforward answer would be to say, look, why should it be Turkey that has to bear the brunt of this crisis, particularly since Turkey is not the sole source of that problem within Syria. Much of it is as much the consequence of Western policy, and I don't mean just the European Union, but numerous other countries that have had an impact on the state of the Middle East. So it doesn't seem like it's fair to simply say, too bad for you, Turkey, you just happen to be there. But the problem is also that to the extent that the EU collectively, and I'm just for the moment keeping Britain within the EU, has more or less decided not to address the problem, the burden is going to fall disproportionately on those countries that are closest to Turkey, because those are the countries to which these people who are going to flee regardless, because one way or another, they're not going to just sit there. You can't say to them, look, we would like you to just sit there and suffer and die, over the next however many decades. They're going to move. There's absolutely nothing one can do about this short of taking action, which would be, impossible from a humanitarian point of view. So to the extent that the group of nations as a whole declines to act on this, the burden will fall on some countries, but not on others. So the responsibility, I think, has to be placed on the collective as a whole to try to address this. Now, if you're looking at, 1 million people moving, if it's 1 million people moving into an area with a population of 500 million, which is roughly the population of Europe, it's 1/500th of the total population, less than the annual birth rate. If, on the other hand, they move into one country like Greece with a population, I think, of about 8 million, then that's a much bigger problem. So I think, here the rational thing to do is to address the problem, across the continent as a whole. But for political reasons, I think most of the countries who are powerful enough are unwilling to accept that strategy. So as far as I can see right now, the policy is simply to do nothing, with the expectation, I suppose, somehow that this will resolve itself, but it won't. So what will happen is that there will be some more serious impact in some particular yet to be determined place. Now, on the question of the impact of an influx of people in, say, somewhere like Britain, in generating a backlash, I think that's probably, true. It's not the case that, everyone is ready to welcome immigrants. It's not the case that, whether you're talking about the United States or the UK, or parts of Europe, that there is no, backlash against immigrants. On the other hand, I think one also has to ask then, what the policy of limiting the movement of people has to mean for not just those outside, we can leave aside their concerns for the moment, what this means for other people within Britain, because they're also affected by immigration restrictions. It's not that the only people who are affected by immigration are those who are affected by the influx of immigrants. if immigrants can't come in, this also has an effect on people. Firstly, it has an effect on people who want them to come in. Secondly, it affects those whose employment is dependent on the influx of immigrants, or whose employment would be harmed if you were to deport people or prevent certain professions from coming in and so on. So you've got to balance these things. And I think it would be wrong to assume that you could have it all. That is to say, you could have an increase in immigration without the sort of backlash that you've mentioned. But it would be wrong to think that, well, that should then drive the policy. We must make sure that there's no, rise of, for example, racist sentiment or a kind of virulent nationalism. And bear in mind also, it's not as if that, if you didn't have any immigration, these people will simply sit back and say, well, that's good. We can now take it easy. We've got, we're not going to go and, bother anybody else. We'll just stay home, watch the footy. And, I don't think that's the case. I think if people are, in fact, dominated by these sorts of attitudes, I think one of the things you've got to ask is, why is this the case? And it's very seldom just that it's the immigration that's bothering them. If there's lots of immigration, but they aren't suffering from other problems, then this will be less of a concern. So maybe one of the things we ought to think about is, not just criticizing these people, but asking, okay, what is it that's really bothering them? What is it that's making them take a more hostile attitude to immigration? Are there other aspects of their concerns that we're simply neglecting, which seems to me very much the case as things stand.
It's interesting. I was once on a panel with Tony Travers, and he's one of your former colleagues at the LSE.
Yes.
And he had done some polling. His research showed that people weren't against immigration, particularly after the accession countries in 2004. They were against the numbers in such a short a period of time. So it was the rate of immigration as opposed to immigration itself. And that was a really interesting finding. British people on the whole aren't anti-immigration, relatively open compared to most of the world, compared to probably the most open country in Europe in many ways.
Yeah. Well, even in the United States, where immigration rhetoric is so powerful, the country as a whole is actually generally pro-immigration. There's not, there is plenty of desire for immigration because so many people simply benefit from it, or for more personal reasons, want to see people coming in. So I think it's more likely that it'll turn into a problem if there are other problems that remain unaddressed.
Right, we've got just over 5 minutes left. If people can help me out by going to the Q&A and voting for the questions, we're not going to be able to get through all 5 remaining questions. But next question from Jameen Patel: does the concept of inherent nationality make sense in a modern globalized world? Could it be something acquired by everyone, like voting rights?
I'm not sure what you mean by inherent nationality, because if you go back to the beginning of my, my presentation, one of the things I want to say is that there is no obvious definition of a national. The definition of national and of the rights of nationality are extremely variable, not just geographically, but temporally. That is to say, at different times, even within a single nation's history, there are different definitions of what makes you a national, and there are different rights that come with nationality. Let me give you an example. I was in the UK for 12 years. For the first 5 years, I held a work permit, which no longer exists as a legal category. After that, I applied for indefinite leave to remain. So I had a year in which I was more or less in limbo. After 6 years, I had indefinite leave to remain. Now, even before then, as a member of, or rather as a citizen of Australia, and therefore a citizen of a Commonwealth country, I was entitled to vote in UK elections, national and local. I think once I became, once I had indefinite leave to remain, I think I could even stand for Parliament, but I was not a citizen. Now, EU citizens had much stronger rights than I had in some ways, but they had no right to vote in UK national elections, because that was just the way the law was. There's no reason it has to be that. There's no reason why being an EU national doesn't make you a British national, but the law could say that. There is no natural conception of nationality. So one of the things you need to ask is, why is it that nationality gets defined in one way or another? Why is it defined, for example, in the United States around 1900, that meant that a woman marrying a man of a different nationality lost her nationality? The same was true, incidentally, in Britain in the 1940s and 50s. If a British woman married a foreigner, she did not acquire the capacity to transmit her nationality to her children. But if a British man married a foreigner, he was able to transmit British nationality to his children. Why is this the case? Well, it's the sexist, environment that's different from the one in which we live. The law has changed. It could change again. There's nothing to stop it changing. So, as I said, there is no natural conception of nationality.
Okay, well, we've got about 4 questions left. We see we've got time for 1 or 2 more of those. So the first question is from an anonymous attendee. Do you think that British immigration policies might lighten after the UK departs from the EU? Just before you answer that, I'll just remind viewers that in the chat function, I have posted a link to an IA publication by Christian Niemitz, where he proposes one immigration policy post-Brexit. Over to you, Chandran.
I don't see any reason why it would go one way or the other. It could go more open, go less open, it could stay the same. And the reason I say this is that if one looks at the history of immigration policy and immigration control, going back for the last 150 years across Europe, the United States, Canada, Australia, it's enormously variable. And it's very much responsive to a mixture of domestic pressures and international pressures. And so to answer that question, you have to look into the future and say, what's going to happen both nationally and internationally, in Britain and the rest of the world? That will have a greater bearing on the outcome. One thing I can tell you, fairly obviously, is that you won't go into a world in which the borders are closed to the extent that say, North Korea is closed, nor will you be going to a world of open borders, whatever that might mean.
Yeah, I think the intention from the early noises of the government and knowing some of the Conservative politicians is to go towards what they claim is a fairer immigration system, no longer giving preference to people with EU passports. Some people saw that as quite racist, giving priority to mostly white EU migrants over mostly non-white migrants. But then it won't be open to borders either. It'll probably be something towards a point system, but it has to be a dynamic point system. As, for example, you fill up those professions that you had vacancies in previously. Yeah.
Well, one thing I didn't talk about in this presentation, which is an enormously important issue, is the relationship between race and racial control and immigration. Immigration policy in most parts of the world has been in one way or another about controlling race. But what's not been actually sufficiently recognized is the extent to which racial classification actually is a consequence of immigration policy rather than a cause of it. Because what often drives immigration policy is the desire to restrict the movement of people from outside into a country for purposes of settlement and so on. Once you do that, you've got to figure out how to determine who's to be allowed in and who's not. Very seldom is it going to be the case that you just say, we're just going to cut the numbers to some absolute amount, because there are all kinds of internal pressures to allow people in. So what happens is that systems of classification emerge. And the history of immigration policy is, to a significant extent, a history of the development of racial classification, because you end up trying to make finer and finer distinctions. To give you just one example, in the United States, from the beginning of the country's founding, the law was very clear. You could not be a citizen of the United States unless you were white. But this raised a very, very difficult question, which is who counts as white? There was a famous case in the early 1900s of a Syrian who claimed to be white. And this case went all the way up to the Supreme Court before he was found to have been white. But this was something that was very strongly supported by the Jewish community from the Middle East, because they were afraid that if the Syrian was regarded as not white, then they, as Jews, wouldn't be classified as white either. So race becomes incredibly important when it comes to immigration control, not just because people try to keep out people with races, but race becomes something that needs to be classified in order to satisfy immigration control demands. It's a very interesting topic and one I can't really even get to the tip of in this very short time, but I encourage people to read further into this.
I think we've come to the end of time for questions, but I'll just make 2 points in response to your last point, which was very interesting until not very long ago in the United States, that if you were from Indian subcontinent, for example, you were still classified as Caucasian. It wasn't until there was an Indian American, not Native American, but an Indian subcontinent American lobby who wanted the Indian immigrants to be classified as not Caucasian because it gave them all sorts of entitlements to as being recognized as a minority. And also an interesting debate during the Brexit referendum that there were pro-immigration people on both sides of the referendum and racists on both sides of the referendum. So there were people, for example, who voted Remain because they were pro-immigration, but they wanted white immigration over non-white immigration. And likewise, there were people who wanted a fair immigration system. And when they said, I want a fair immigration system, they were accused of the Remain campaign of wanting to let in lots of non-white, non-Europeans. So it just shows what a complex issue it is. Chandran, thank you very much for joining us today. We've run out of time. There are still many questions to come. And I know a number of people had more than one question. But sadly, we've run out of time. It just shows that your discussion, your points you made, clearly provoked a lot of interest. And also people will look to buy your book. While I'm finishing up, if there's a link to the book anywhere, please feel free to post it.
Yeah, I wish they were, but it'll be out in about 9 months, hopefully. So,
okay, well, hopefully we'll invite you back then, and maybe even in person. So can I thank all the viewers and listeners for joining us today? I hope you found it as fascinating as we did. Well, thank you for watching or listening. For more details of our content online, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, IA London, or listen to our podcasts on Podbean. You can also find our content online at ia.org.uk. And to help us keep providing free content during these tough times, please do consider making a contribution, no matter how modest, by donating online at ia.org.uk. Thank you for watching or listening.